my boring Word document so I can get these written down. So, unsuccessful. Let's just start with group 1 again, because it's predictable. We had different people in group 1 this time.
Different?
It was
Right?
the same group.
Oh, it was the same group because we didn't actually add another group. We made our own.
Yeah, that
That's
was
okay.
my
Group
fault.
1.
I didn't. Yeah, the extra group was in the main meeting room.
Mm-hmm. We made it work.
I took some notes, so maybe I'll just read this list. It's a good one. When the presenter's questions are all, does anyone know, rather than what do you notice, what are you interested in? Let's see, operator not familiar enough with the equipment. I think maybe one of the most resonating one was the information vomit. I love that term.
Oh, I like that too. You know what, let's go with 3 from your group, John, and then just so we don't take everybody's. But
Okay.
I like this list so far.
Well, let me add one more. When the audience has had too much alcohol and isn't into what you're doing.
Okay.
That's not a factor you can control, though.
Maybe not.
That's right.
Has that been a problem at the hall recently, John?
That was someone else's contribution.
Okay, I think we're on to group 2 then.
All right, group 2. Talking to rather than with the audience. Along with the information vomit, too many numbers, just going on and on about this distance or that size, and vocabulary that's either too advanced for your audience or you're not explaining it. And another thing we didn't like was showing things to your audience that they can't actually see. So, you know, whether like a picture of the Orion Nebula, it's a beautiful thing, but when somebody looks at it through a telescope, they're not going to see what the Hubble telescope sees if they look through a backyard telescope. So showing people what they actually can see with their backyard telescopes or with the telescope you've got outside that they're going to look through after the show.
Amie, I'm going to jump in and just say that making the disclaimer that this is a long exposure photograph, you're not going to see 4 different colors. Okay.
Yep. We had lots of other things, but I'll let you move on.
Okay, thanks. We'll probably have some leftovers after we go around once. So group number 3.
All right, that was us again. I think Karrie's making a dig at how much I talked during the last reporting session, so I'll keep this one shorter. But we had 3 main things that we brought up, and I can expand a little on each. But the main thing is talking about questions. We spent actually a lot of our time talking about questions and the type of questions, and some of this has come up with what other people said. So that was sort of one thing, just very briefly. Another thing was time management. When you have basically a presenter who doesn't know how to manage their time. I wouldn't know anybody like that as someone who rambled on for the last segment. But and then the balance of enthusiasm was kind of the third thing, where as a presenter, you know, you should have a certain amount of enthusiasm. Even if you've given the show 500 times before, it's as Tony put it, it's the first time for your audience. So you need to have an appropriate level. On the other hand, you don't want to be too enthusiastic, because then it can be off-putting for the audience. We're like, whoa, this, like, you know, what are they doing? So so those are kind of the 3 things that we focused on. But if I could circle back to questions just for a moment, is just to give a plug to Allan. Allan Gould here, many years ago. Maybe he doesn't want to say how many years ago, but he and staff at the Lawrence Hall of Science created worked on the Planetarium Educators Workshop Guide, which is available on the IPS website. And mainly I know about that because at the very first LIPS, a lot of things I learned very first LIPS, Karrie. But Allan presented one of there's what like 10 modules or a dozen modules, something like that in the workshop. But one of the modules is questioning strategies, and it was all about the different types of questions that you can have yes or no questions, and you can have questions about numbers, but what we kind of focused on was you don't want them all to be the same type of question. You want to have some open-ended questions. It's useful to have some yes or no questions, but to mix it up, and there's different ways to let people respond and to be prepared for open-ended. Don't be afraid of open-ended questions, but not always having to have something that has a singular right answer or a wrong answer. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
All
I'll stop
right. Excellent. I have so many bullet points here. Before I was going by the number of bullet points was the group I was on. Am I in group 4? Is that
Group
right?
4,
Yeah, I thought
yes.
so.
Fourth next.
That's Carol, Joanne, Mary, Patty, and Vincent.
Yay for group 4. Oh.
Anyone
am
from
I-
group 4 want to share something?
Am I like the self-appointed spokesperson?
Come on, we only got 10 minutes left.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so,
That was my East Coaster impersonation.
well, even though we talked about things that were out of your control, I talked about how one of the things that bombed in my own live presentation is I created an activity that required the students to be able to look at something that the lighting in my planetarium wasn't actually good enough for them to see what they were supposed to do to finish their task. So that was a fail on the part of me as a provider. Even though I can't control how much lighting is in my planetarium, I should have been aware of that. And so I didn't find out until the students were really not able to finish their activity. But thankfully, as middle school students, and they actually were allowed to use their cell phones because I let them use the flashlight so they could actually see better. So that was kind of a fail. The other thing we talked about is jokes that bomb. I think we've all been there.
Never.
It's awkward being the one presenting with the joke that bombed, and it's awkward being in the audience when there's a really bad joke that's presented. So
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because the same joke sometimes will work great with one audience and totally bomb with another, you know, so you never know for sure. A lot
Yeah.
of us.
Make a note of that. Yeah, it's all comes back to knowing your audience a bit. Okay. Group 5.
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning the bomb. That was on our list also. I worked with many leaders in our field, including Diane Carlson, Betty Tatar in Hawaii, who really like planetarium. We're all, and one of the things they mentioned is that self-referential jokes that you think are really funny. I know it's hypocritical for those of you who know me, Joanne and Karrie, that I would bring this up, but a lot of the humor I've seen, and this is true to this very day, falls flat. And I think humor can really connect and engage an audience. You've got to really think it out and make sure it's not like a self-referential or heavy-handed or corny. Again, read your audience as well, but I think that's really important to kind of get at that. And also, yeah, I think the information vomit is a really good expression. And again, this is a lot of observation I've done recently, including in viewing folks, you know, who in different areas. Just that mistake that you think the audience loves and knows the topic like we do, and just drowns them in information. And trying to find that right balance is so important to get beyond. You know, we're in a lucky time now where we have the technology to be cool again. We turned an Omnimax into a planetarium in New Jersey. Now's the time to kind of get beyond the things that used to turn folks off from the experience. Information vomit and humor.
Yep.
I will
I'm
not
glad
put
you mentioned
myself
that.
in the Hypocrites Hall of Fame, because Lord knows I've led the charge on the humor thing. I got better.
I'm glad you brought that up about assuming too much or too little knowledge from the audience. That's definitely huge.
Yeah.
All right. I think that was all the groups that were in the breakout rooms. And then there were those of us in the main room.
Yeah,
And
the one thing that I mentioned first was it's already actually on your list in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's the part that when the audience has had too much to drink. Well, my comment was that an unresponsive audience is a problem. That would be way too much to drink.
That's comatose. Yeah. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Is Constance still there? I can't really see my list of participants since I'm on this.
I'm still here.
Okay. Constant was telling us some interesting things about his theater. Some interesting challenges of a 460 audience members seated at one time with, I made some notes here, multilingual, 11 official languages. He's from South Africa. Did you want to say a little bit more about that to the whole group, Constant?
Yeah, it's just sometimes because we use huge audiences, that normally what we will find is, we get from different backgrounds people. So you will have kids coming from rural areas, as well as people from private schools. So the big problem there is that, if you start asking questions and things, then the private schools will answer, but your rural schools, for instance, will not. They will shut up. They will not take part. They won't do anything, and that becomes very difficult to control them, especially when you have a big group like that in the auditorium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really big group. That's one of the biggest theaters I've ever heard of. I'm impressed that you do live interactive programs. It's tough.
Now, most of our programs are live.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Nice. Did anybody think of other things? Actually, let me scroll back up here just a little bit. Might have to reduce, go down to 100% here and see if we can, whoops, other direction. See if we can get the whole thing to show up.
Carrie, there are a couple of comments in the chat.
Okay. I can't see the chat at all when I'm over here. So do you want to read them to me, Amy?
Yeah, sure. Steve said, if the audience is too small, you may get no feedback.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Patty said, or the students have been told by their teachers that they must be quiet, so they don't respond at all. Or the teachers don't let their students clap or gasp in amazement.
Yeah, I hate that.
Rosemary in our group also mentioned the challenge of getting the age appropriateness right, trying to balance your content to fit especially when you have multiple groups. I think in a theater can really be a challenge. And Caitlin in our group also mentioned that letting them see can be a problem. For example, if you have an operator and enter and they're not in the same page and they're correcting each other in front of an audience, not ideal.
Yep. Okay. Staff. I'm not quite sure how to put that. Staff disagreements about that in front of audiences.
It can be the general category of letting them see you sweat. Whether it's disagreement or you being frazzled by the wrong. Oh, that's the wrong image. Apologizing profusely.
It keeps coming back to haunt me. All right.
Classroom management is always a challenge.
Yeah.
Whether you have an education background or not, because I have a master's in teaching, and I don't think they did a great job teaching us classroom management in that program. So, but obviously being in a theater is different than a classroom. So, how do you manage the kids who are chatting, parents aren't shushing their kids, or everybody is now shushing those kids who are talking?
Yeah.
Hockey stick.
Yep. I'm going to say how to get appropriate level of conversation. It's tricky. Yeah, classroom management in the dark is a whole different beast. I think I'll probably do a complete workshop on that at some point. Okay.
That would be great. One thing I've noticed, a weird thing, is I've seen kids talk throughout my entire live presentation, and as soon as the recorded show starts, they're silent.
Yeah.
Because they're all so used to watching videos and watching TV and movies that they know to be quiet when the recording starts.
Ah, okay. I got to try to figure out how to flip that on its head.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. We just checking my iPad here to see what time it is. 2:58. Wow, we have 2 minutes left. We're not going to get to small groups for my last question.
Actually, our time span was not set at 1 hour.
Oh, okay.
It usually is an hour, but that's not a hard and fast rule.
Okay.
We can let people go who expected it to be an hour, but those who want to stay can stay.
Okay, yeah, we can stay for, so I have a couple things I need to cross off my to-do list before the weekend starts, but we can stay for a few more minutes. The last thing that I wanted us to think about, which one that I was having a hard time coming up with a question for small groups anyway, so maybe we'll just stay here in the big group. And it was, I was going to ask people to think about these lists that we've generated: successful, unsuccessful, programs, and I know it's going to be hard for you to remember all of them. If I make this small enough to have them all on the screen, we won't be able to read them. But let's focus maybe on, let's pick one interesting, particularly interesting, unsuccessful aspect. I'm going to go to something that Constant pointed out during our group and talked about it here about that multilingual audience having to all attend shows presented in the same language. Language is not the only thing that can come into play here. So I think one of the reasons I find public shows to be far, far harder than school shows is because you have audience members at completely different levels. And so what I'd like us to think about here is, let's take just a few minutes to talk about strategies for reading the audience and adapting a subject to different age levels and knowledge levels, if that makes sense. So strategies for making a subject applicable to different people. Let's start with that. Good enough question?
Can you rephrase the question?
I'm not sure I can. No, I'll try. So what are some strategies that you use? Let's drop the multilingual thing altogether. I talked myself out of that. And let's just think about public shows where you might have families with a 4-year-old child all the way up to senior citizens. And let's say you're doing your standard Tonight Sky show, because that's one that we all do. So what are some strategies that you use to offer things of interest to the 4-year-old as well as to the adults in the audience?
Well, visually engaging is always going to connect really well. So if you have something that really is compelling visually, it's going to keep them engaged. I think also just trying to get the balance, making sure there's enough to appeal to each of your segments. I mean, clearly, again, going back to Liberty Science Center, giant 400-seat theater with exactly the demographic you're talking about. And that really has been the mix that we try to go for, is to have enough visual stuff to really keep people glued and to make sure there's something for the young as well as for those who are more wanting a higher end experience. It is a challenge. I think we all know it's a challenge. Most of us, I think, don't have a restriction on age anymore for public planetarium shows.
Yeah.
And so trying to find that right sweet spot is a wonderful thing about our field, but it's also probably the biggest challenge, at least in my experience, of how do you engage everyone, neither turning off the adults nor losing the kids with the dynamics.
Yeah.
One thing, one thing it would be asking questions to get a sense of where the audience is at in general. That doesn't really tell you anything about the people who are not answering questions. But another thing would be to not dwell on a more technical answer or a more technical aspect. But to not avoid it altogether, because that would be, that would be a way to capture the people who are more advanced in their knowledge. But in order to not lose the others, you can't dwell on that for too long.
Telling stories.
Yes, I was just going to say, bouncing around a little bit so there's a little humor. You've got something for the kids. What shape is this? What does it look like to you? You can provide some information for the adults. Well, is the sun the biggest star? Well, how would you answer that? Do you have images? Can you convey, a red supergiant compared to a red dwarf, you could still convey stuff, even if you've got an audience, let's say, full of third graders. The adults also should get something out of it. And so I don't hesitate sometimes to say, for the adults, you might also want to, investigate this, or I'll also present it so it's suitable for both ages.
Yeah, I think you need to take the Pixar approach toward storytelling, because I found the Pixar movies, while they're geared toward kids, there's always adult humor or adult graphics. So, my public groups tend to be very young, but for the middle school kids that come, you know, when I'm telling the stories, it's fun for the kids, but I try to throw in something that only the older kids and adults would get. It takes some practice and time, but I find it worthwhile because everybody seems to leave happy.
Looney Tunes, Chuck Jones.
If there are questions or ideas that people can talk to with a peer they're sitting next to or a family member, then it doesn't really matter, you know, whether you're talking to them at the right level, because they're talking to each other at the level they're at, or in the family group where the parents and kids have that relationship.
That's a great conversation. Or a great idea. I want to go back to Allan's idea, questions to get a sense of where people are. Allan doesn't have to be the only one that answers that, but what are some questions that you might use there? I know the one I use, but other people might have ideas too.
Maybe a question like, do you remember when the Challenger Center blew up? The Challenger blew up.
They blew up a
Start a
Challenger?
happy
Isn't that
conversation.
horrible?
Where were you when?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm reminded of a show that I gave one time where it would have been helpful to ask, do you know what a galaxy is?
Yeah.
And have somebody, because I went through a whole show about, that was about galaxies, and I got to the end, and then one of the kids asked, what's a galaxy?
Yeah. I've had moments like that.
Yeah. Liberty Science Center is doing online programming, like basically Planetarium shows online every Thursday now. And the Facebook Live chat feed is really interesting in terms of getting direct questions and realizing right away, a lot of folks have no idea what a galaxy is,
Yeah.
or what a supernova is, let alone a neutron star. So it's actually been a real education this last month to have this feed over Facebook where folks feel safe to ask you any question, because it made it really clear, oh, you just can't assume that they know these things.
Yeah.
Or maybe to ask how many of you know what a galaxy is. You know, if you say, do you know, you may get, Mr. Smarty telling you what it is. But if you ask like a more open-ended question, then you get more of a feel for the scope in the audience.
That's a very good, but you still need to have somebody say what a galaxy is.
Yes.
Yeah, make sure we're all talking about the same thing. I think I saw Toshi's hand raised. Did I imagine that?
Oh, well, that was for something else, but
Oh, okay.
but one thing about questions to ask is that we would do with field trips, and even with well, a little bit less so with public shows, because usually we're on a tighter time constraint. But certainly for field trips, I would always ask, just what are some things, what's something that's in space, and then you kind of get a sense, like if they're all talking about exoplanets and neutron stars, then you kind of know your audience is at one level. But if they're saying, if they're just naming the planets and like that's all they can think of, then so you kind of get a sense of so just sort of what's a thing in space.
I like that.
But just the other thing I was going to say related to questioning strategies, and Robin brought this up in our last breakout group, was the idea when you're asking questions to make sure that you give enough time for the audience to think of an answer and to respond. And in particular, I think it's still helpful when you have a public show where you have a wide audience range, that something that a teenager who's there, they can think of the answer like that, but if you have a younger audience member, that they might take a little bit longer to think of the answer. So but to give enough space and enough time for people to actually think of the answer, like process your question, think of the answer, and then for them to be able to raise their hand or respond however they're going to. so that they have a chance. Because as Robin brought up, in particular in the classroom, there's a tendency for you ask a question and you wait like a beat and then you give the answer because no one has responded. It's like, well, if you only give a second, then of course no one's going to respond.
It's not realistic. Yeah. One of the things that I learned, I think, from Toshi at the first lips was not to just stop when you get to the answer you're hoping for. Take a few more answers so you get more drawn out. You can get more audience feedback that way.
Karrie, I had it drilled into me a long time ago, and for some people it's obvious and maybe it's not, to take answers from as many different people as possible. As Karrie just mentioned, don't just take one answer. Sometimes I'll take 2 or 3 answers, and those 3 answers together form the complete answer that I was looking for.
Yeah.
So are you doing boys? Are you doing girls? I like to remind, if I'm doing school groups or something, remind that it's okay for the adults to ask questions too. Sometimes, give somebody who's, has been putting their hand up and you haven't gotten to them, again, try to hit as many people as you can.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I could think about in terms of gauging where they are and talking about how, instead of asking, do you know what like a galaxy is? For those of us that are school-based, even when you're doing public groups, it might be good to be aware of how NGSS frames things with their phenomena-based. Everything starts with a phenomenon. So if you're going to talk about galaxies, maybe start by showing the visualization of the colliding galaxies. And that will generate the questions. What is that? What's happening here? What are they? So that leads them to ask the questions about what a galaxy is. So that way you're really engaging them more because you're showing them a phenomena. You're not asking that direct question. You're getting them to ask the question.
Oh, that's great. Okay, any last thoughts about that? That's a great list.
Sorry, you can tell I'm a teacher, right?
No, that's good.
Yeah,
Karrie,
Patty, if your arm is getting tired, you can put your hand down.
Karrie, I was just going to say that sometimes if Jonathan was presenting a program and I'm up in the back of the theater and he knows I'm there and he'll get some question on, I'm going to say space exploration history, which is not his forte. He'll say, hey, Chris, can you answer that one, kind of thing. It's okay to hand off if that's not your thing. Or sometimes I'll answer a question and Jonathan will throw in an extra bit of information, not to contradict me, but to add to the value of the answer.
Yep, that's great. Awesome. Well, that's a great list. And that brings us to 3:12 p.m. And I know we didn't have any firm end time, but that's about an hour altogether since we really officially began, which I think is a good amount of time to be in a Zoom conversation. So let me actually stop sharing my screen, not just hiding behind my Word document. But I want to thank everybody for participating. So these notes that I've typed up, I will flesh them out a little bit better, add to some of my thoughts, and then make them available. So I'll share them in various places. Hopefully you'll see the announcement in more than one place. I want to thank Allan for recording this. I see David's got his hand up.
Yeah, there were a couple of inputs in the chat there. You might want to gather those in your notes as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think Allan will get a record of the chat. And I can
in the recording. Yeah, there's a chat that's saved, so I'll send that over to Karrie.
Excellent. Yeah, good point. I will take a look at those and make sure I add anything that I missed.
And I want to thank Karrie, actually. I want to say, everybody right now, make sure you unmute, unmute yourself, and then let's have a round of applause because this was a great session. Thank you, Karrie.
Thank you. Thank you, Karrie. Good to see your faces. I always feel a little bit like the Brady Bunch here in this gallery view, but it's a much bigger group. So thank you all. And hopefully many of you saw that we are planning on doing some LIPS online workshops during the days that we would have had LIPS had it been happening in person. So stay tuned for notices about how to propose a session and also how to participate in those. And in case you're not if you don't live and breathe LIPS like I do, the days are Tuesday, July 14th through Thursday, July 16th. We'll do probably 2 or 3 hours worth of programming on each of those days. Be a good opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to it. Not the same as being in person, better than nothing.
Yes.
Yeah.
The story of our lives nowadays.
It really is. All right.
All right.
Somebody commented earlier about I was just going to say, somebody commented earlier about the size of Constant of the theater there. And I seem to recall that somebody from the Nehru Planetarium in India once said that they seated, I think, 650 or 700.
Wow.
And that's going to be another multilingual group. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I love a big audience, so bring them on.
Okay, and I might mention that before we actually end the meeting, again, thanks, Karrie.
Yeah.
We're going to continue the monthly Planetarians web seminar. There are also the e-conferences that were started by Mike McConville with the Dome Dialogues that most of you know about and are participants of. The next couple of ones that we have lined up for here, I think May, we're going to have Jeff Nee with the Museum Alliance, who's going to do a presentation there. And then in May, that's May, and in June we have Jason Fletcher is going to talk about that thing that he sent to Domel of a virtual, what was it? It was something that I really wanted to try out in my planetarium, but I had no idea what it was. So he's going to talk about that. It seemed like really intriguing, a way to get a thing up on your dome that is an art form, basically, with music. So anyway, thanks again for everybody for coming. We still have 27 participants here.
Yeah, that's
and
great.
Before you go, if you didn't sign in, go ahead and sign in the sign sheet, which is the chat. Just say who you are and where you're from. People who came in late may want to do that. Okay, thanks again.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you. We'll see you.
Thanks so much.